Hey, welcome back. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Final Gathering, but what we're going to do is cover Final Gathering from a different angle. We're going to cover how to use animation with Final Gathering and how to render correctly an architectural fly-through of an architectural visualization. So let's go ahead and let's do that. Let's open up an example scene I have for you here. And the example scene you're looking for is called FG Animation Start. So let's open that one up. Okay, so what we have here is a pretty simple scene. What I went ahead and is I took this architectural scene here and I applied a soft white shader to pretty much everything except the background cards that we have back there, the images in the background. Those are the only things that are going to be textured in this particular scene. So we're going to have ourselves a nice clay render. The other thing that I did was I went ahead and did some very simple camera animation. So it's a 450 frame animation to simulate an architectural visualization fly-through or walkthrough of this room. So you can see here as I scrub the timeline, I have myself a pretty simple animation here of this room. Okay. Now, before we do anything, let's just go ahead and do a preview render and see what we have. Okay, so here's our sort of clay render here. Doesn't look too good. We're missing indirect illumination. To fix that, what you would normally do is add something like global illumination, or in our case, Final Gathering. So let's go ahead and close that. Let's go ahead and open up our renderer options here. And we can see that if we go to Final Gathering, it's off by default. So let's go ahead and turn that on. I'm going to pin down that PPG. So here's my default options here. Every time you create a new scene in XSI, this is what you're going to get. So I'm going to switch from multi-frame here to automatic. And just for the sake of rendering faster, I'm just going to tone this down to about 32 rays for Final Gathering. Okay. And when it comes to Final Gathering, flickering, and animation, the two most important settings that you want to concern yourself with is the map file settings down here and the map file name right below it. Okay. So this is the way that Mental Ray is going to work when you're creating a Final Gather map for animation. Every time the camera moves or changes position, Final Gathering has to be computed because Final Gathering is view dependent. It's based on the camera and what the camera sees. Okay. The reason that we get Final Gather flickering when animating with Final Gathering is because the camera is always moving because it's an animation. Something's moving in the scene, and that forces Final Gathering to have to recompute all the time. That having to recompute all the time is what's causing the Final Gather flickering. So let me go ahead and just show you visually what Final Gather flickering looks like, just so you get a better idea in case you're not sure what I'm talking about. If I go down here to my animation controls and I click on playback and then go ahead and select flipbook, it opens up the excellent XSI flipbook here. And I'm going to go ahead and open up some images here, and the directory you want to be in is this current project directory. In the render pictures folder, you'll find another folder called FG animation. And if we go into FG animation, we'll see that we have two sets of different animation passes here. The one we're going to open up now is FG animation no map. Okay, so let's hit OK and then click OK again to load that up. And here's a little preview animation here, and if I hit play, you're going to notice that something went horribly wrong with this animation. If I play that opening sequence again, you'll see what it is. If you notice that there's something wrong with the lighting in the scene, there appears to be this sort of blotchy effect that keeps flickering all over the place. It looks completely horrible. And as I continue to play the animation, it's more evident that something went seriously wrong with this render. And you can see over here in this entire area that there's this disgusting flickering happening with our lighting. What is that flickering and what's causing it? Well, the flickering is the actual Final Gathering. And what's causing it? The thing that's causing it is the fact that we used the wrong technique to render this Final Gathering out. So basically, with these current settings right here, if I were to go ahead and render an animated sequence here, in this case a 450 frame animation of this scene, I'm going to end up with a very disgusting render at the end that looks just like the one that I just showed you, with a bunch of light flickering all over the place, which is totally unacceptable. You can't deliver that to a client. There's just no way. So why is that exactly happening? Well, the reason it's happening is because right now my map file setting is set to overwrite existing file, which is the first option here, and happens to be the default option with new scenes and XSI. Okay, this isn't the best option to use. In terms of animation with Final Gathering, this is actually your worst enemy. You never want to render out an animation with Final Gathering with override existing file. And when people don't have experience with this and they're not sure what they're doing, usually what they do is they won't know about this option down here. Instead, they'll come up here and increase the number of rays to say 1,000 or something like that. They'll waste an entire day rendering out an animation just to come back and be horrified to see that their animation still has flickering. So then they figure, oh, well, let me increase that to 2,000. Then they'll spend an entire week rendering just to come back and be horrified to see that there's still flickering in the animation. So increasing the number of rays does reduce the flickering to a certain degree, but it never completely gets rid of it. So to get rid of it completely, no matter how many rays you're using, you have to create a final gather map file and freeze it. Okay, so how in the world do we create a final gather map file and freeze it? Well, it's actually simpler than you may think. You just have to know the technique for doing it. And the technique for doing it is what I'm going to show you right now. Okay, down here we have ourselves three different options. Override existing file, which is no good. We don't want to use that when rendering out for animation. And then we have these two options down here, which are very good for rendering out with Final Gather during animations. Okay, so which option do we use? Only use FG points from file or append new FG points to file? Well, we're going to render this out in two phases. Phase 1 is going to create a Final Gather map pass. Phase 2 is going to use the frozen map pass to render out the final sequence or the final animation. So what we want to do now is have this option turned on, the one that says append new FG points to file. Essentially what this option does is we're going to go ahead and render out the animation here, the 450 frame sequence, and this option is going to allow Final Gathering to basically add more points to itself. So every time the camera changes and new Final Gather points have to be created, they'll be created for us and they'll be appended to or added to the final FG map, okay, which is extremely important. Down here in the map file name, we want to change the name. Now we don't have to, we can go with the default name here, but I find it to be very good practice to come in here and change the name. So I'm going to call this animation for the sake of keeping everything consistent here and having it make sense. This Final Gather map file, when created, it's going to be called animation.fgmap. Okay. Now, number of rays, I'm going to keep to 32. Of course, for a production render, you want to increase the number of rays a lot more than 32, say 256, or maybe even 512. I'm going to go with 32 just for demonstration purposes. Okay. And these options all look pretty good, so I'm pretty happy with this. Now, there's another important aspect to this, and if we go up here to the optimization tab of the mental rate parameters up here, we'll see that we have this render type option down here. And by default, it's set to full render, and what that means is that right now, since we have Final Gathering turned on, if we create a render, the render is going to go ahead and calculate Final Gathering, and it's going to go ahead and render out the final image with anti-aliasing and all that stuff. We don't want to do that right now because right now what we want to do is a Final Gather map pass. So what we want to do is switch from full render to Final Gathering only. Okay, and that's going to allow us to create a Final Gathering solution for the entire animation sequence. Alright, so if we look at Final Gathering, we have append new FG points to file set up, and we have our Final Gather map named. If I come over here to render and go to my pass options, I can see that my frame range is set to render from frame 1 to 450. I can always come in here and rename the animation, but I'm not going to do that in this case. This is perfectly fine. And at this point, I can just go ahead and go to render and select current pass. And XSI and Mental Ray are going to go ahead and render out the current pass. Now you can see it's rendering out fairly quickly. We're using a very small number of rays, only 32. And the fact that we're using the append new Final Gather points to file option actually speeds up the calculation of Final Gathering. And the reason that is because, well, what the append new Final Gather points to file does, it renders out Final Gather points for, say, the first frame, right? On the second frame, because the animation didn't change a lot from frame 1 to 2, there's really no need to calculate all the final gather points that are in this scene or in the view of the camera all over again from scratch. So what Mentor does is it looks at it and says, okay, these final gather points didn't change, so we're not going to change those. But because the camera angle changed by this much, we're going to add these few points here and these few points there. So basically, final gathering will actually speed up and render faster and faster. Okay? So you can see the final gather points are rendering fairly quickly. Now, I'm at frame 6 right now. Now I'm moving on to frame 7. You also notice that the final gathering is the only thing that's being rendered out right now. After it finishes the final gathering for a specific frame, in this case frame 7, and frame 7 just finished, you'll notice that it doesn't continue rendering frame 7. It doesn't do any anti-aliasing or anything like that. That's because we changed our, up here in the optimization tab, we changed our setting from full render to final gathering only. And this is great because it allows you to create your final gather map in a single pass, and you can see it's going by fairly quickly. Okay. Now I'm going to abort this. I'm just going to cancel that out because I don't want to go ahead and render out the whole sequence. I already did. So I'll leave that to you. You can render it in your own free time and see what you get. Okay. So that's going to do it for that. Let me go ahead and close the pass options there. Okay, so let's pretend for the sake of argument here that we rendered out the full 400 frame sequence, which I did on my own time, just so you don't have to sit here and watch a 450 render sequence here and sit here for hours watching that. Wouldn't be too fun. So I went ahead and did that myself. So assuming that it finished rendering out the 450 frames and it's done, what do I do now? Well, now that I have a final gather map, and if I hit 5 on the keyboard to open up a browser here, and I go to my render pictures directory, I can see here's my animation.fg map. It's about a 4 megabyte file in this case. Of course, it'd be a lot bigger if I would have allowed it to continue rendering to frame 450. Alright, so the more points that are appended or added to the final gather map, the larger the final gather map is going to become. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so now that this animation final gather map has been created and exists on my hard drive in my project directory, what do I do? Well, the next step is to come in here and switch the map file setting to use only FG points from file. What this does, it freezes the map, so to speak. So now Mentor is going to go, okay, I'm not going to calculate final gather. Instead, I'm going to pick up this animation.fg map down here, and I'm going to use that because it already has all the final gather map data appended to it. Okay, so after we do that, we have to come back to optimization and change from final gathering only to full render. That way when we render out our current pass, it renders out the actual images as opposed to any final gathering. Okay, so now that my final gathering map setting is set to frozen or use only FG points from file, what I can do is just come over here to render and render out the current pass. And now what it's going to do, it's just going to render out the actual image. It's going to skip the final gathering. It's just going to read the final gathering data from the file, and that's it. You can start to see as this is being rendered out that it does have final gathering. It does have that nice indirect illumination that you can see in the shadowy areas there. So our scene's looking pretty good. But you notice that we're just skipping on through and rendering out the final image. We're not rendering out or calculating any type of final gathering data, so we're going to render out faster. And because the final gather map is frozen and was already pre-calculated for us when we created the first pass, the first final gather pass before, what's going to happen is the final gathering flickering is going to be completely gone. Okay, so I'm not going to sit here and have you watch this render out 450 frames of this. So I'm just going to abort, and I'm going to fast forward through time and pretend like I already, rendered this stuff out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here to playback and open up the flipbook again. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to load the second animation here, which is the one that I already did, the Final Gather Frozen Map Pass. So I'll go ahead and load that up. You're going to notice first frame looks virtually identical to the previous animation I showed you. But when I hit play, you'll notice there's a big difference. As you can see, there is absolutely no final gather flickering at all. None. The map is completely frozen in place. There is 0% flickering in this animation. And again, the reason that's happening, which is a good thing to happen, is because I went ahead and used the technique I just showed you to render this out. I created a Final Gather map pass first using the append to Final Gather Points file option, and I froze the map. Then I rendered again the full render with the map frozen. So it was set to only use the Final Gather Points from file. So there we go. Beautiful. Now as you can see, the final gathering solution in this case wasn't exactly the best, and I did that on purpose as a preview render just so that this renders out quickly. I didn't want to sit here and render something out that takes too long to render. If you want to render this out at higher quality, use the same exact technique I just showed you, but instead of using 32 rays, use something higher like 256 rays or maybe even 512 rays. Again, I tend to use numbers that are a power of 2. I've been brainwashed to think that way. So use something like 500 rays to go ahead and render this out nicely. Okay? So that's the technique. That's how you can go ahead and render this out. Any type of fly through or product visualization or architectural visualizations, whenever you have to render out with animation with Final Gathering, use this technique and you will never ever have Final Gather flickering in your scene ever again. Okay? Alright, so that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.